would like to introduce Ted, who I don't think needs much of an introduction, but Ted is a lifelong resident of the town of Palm Beach. He's served on the town council for the last 3 years. And prior to that, he was on the Landmarks Preservation Commission for 10 years. And 8 of those years, he served as its chair. And I believe you also served 1 year on the Architectural Commission before you were elected to the town council. Well, welcome, Ted. Aimee Sonny is our Director of Preservation and Planning, which is a new position that we recently created. Previously, she was the Director of Education for six years. And this new position is so she can fully dedicate herself to advocacy, working with residents in the town to share the wonderful archives that we have here and advise on best preservation practices. Aimee has studied architecture at the University of Notre Dame. She has a master's degree in historic preservation. She is also a certified planner. So all wonderful credentials to have here on our team. Please welcome me. So as one of the founders of the Preservation Foundation, Bob Grace's monumental contributions to the town are a topic that we discuss frequently amongst our staff and our board. After conducting many of the interviews for the video we just viewed, there are a few connections that I was able to make for the first time. One thing that struck me was learning that Bob grew up on a farm, and then hearing Jeff Smith explain that the zoning code he helped adopt controls development through the preservation of open space. In fact, multiple interviewees also spoke to how important open space was to Bob. So what are your thoughts on the importance of open space and its impact on how we experience the built environment?
Well, thanks. And I just want to say how honored I am to be here today. And thank you to the Grace family for putting this on. I've had a ton of fun preparing and reading through a trove of documents that have been really enlightening to me about the more modern history. I mean, within the past 50 years of what saved this town from the brink. And those conversations are hyper relevant because we're all feeling the pressures of development intensity at a high level once again. So back to the open space, it's interesting to see. I mean, you see this play out really well at the south end, which was undergoing development south of Sloan's Curve, that once you hit the town's southern limits and you enter into the town of South Palm Beach, the buildings are on top of each other. There's no sense of space, light, and air. So that sense of space really distinguishes even this multifamily area. And when you get up to the north end of town, a lot of the restrictions we see in our residential neighborhoods that have also preserved light and air and sense of green space. I mean, the lush landscape environment is much characteristic of this town as the wonderful architecture. There are areas in town, like I think of Via Meisner, that are wonderful spaces that don't have much green space that this kind of prohibition could squash. But as we heard Jeff Smith alluding to in the video, I think there was higher level of confidence in the products being proposed and the skill of architects at the time than there may be in the present environment.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Ted. And I also want to thank everyone for being here, and also thank Maisie and Jack for sharing with us the wonderful letters that we were able to read through to really get a better understanding of exactly what was going on in the 1970s with all of the zoning changes and everything that Bob was working on. I think he writes a lot about context and about how important it is to look at the context around you. And so when he's talking about open space and green space, he was very cognizant of the differences in town. Worth Avenue is not the same as the North End, is not the same as the South End. And so I think that that's a really important thing to consider as we look at any kind of future zoning changes, is making sure that we're considering the context and what's really appropriate to that area. Because having green space and light and air on the South End is incredibly important, and I think is really a defining characteristic of that area. But when you think about Worth Avenue, it's more defined by some street trees and some street landscaping, but you have this progression of buildings and spaces that pulls you along from one place to the next. And I think that that's really important. That's what creates this really wonderful pedestrian walkable experience on Worth Avenue and in our Town Hall Square district as well, that really promotes walkability. It promotes neighbors and people in town coming together. It's a gathering place and a greeting place. And so I think it's looking at what's appropriate for the context and making sure that it respects the history and heritage of the area.
And one other thought on kind of green open space and setbacks. There was a really interesting part I read way too late last night about setbacks that, you know, when reviewing all these things and understanding the town's presently re-looking at our zoning code and looking to make corrections, it was really informative to read primary source materials from when this stuff was enacted to see what we did really well and areas we can improve, because that's part of the purpose of going through this effort. And there was an outstanding memo from Bob Grace in this packet about setbacks. And so he was really sensitive and in touch with that every street isn't the same. And he had a quote that's something that there's no precise front yard setback to be prescribed. And he'd run through a whole, I mean, it was really thorough. He'd run through a whole statistic of the average setbacks on different streets, Tangier versus a C Street versus somewhere else. And he'd come up with rough average setbacks and proposed a metric so that when something new infill was built, it was contextual with the street environment. And in this memo, he says, something to the extent of, I'm really struggling getting the zoning consultant at the time, Adlai, to understand this simple concept.
Right.
And when I work with the current zoning code, I don't think that successfully made it in, but it was a great idea. We kind of have more of a one size fits all approach. And that, as we know in town, there's different size lots and different character streets. And so, like, as we study zoning, I'm gonna pull that memo out for some ideas.
Absolutely.
So another significant aspect of the code that Bob put in place limits development through parking requirements. Do you believe that parking requirements are an effective means to control development? And what are the practical implications of relying on this mechanism?
Yeah, well, it was really successful. You know, the parking requirements in our zoning code prevent hyper-intense uses, and had they not been implemented, there could have been worse intensity than we see or experience now. For instance, if you guys wanted to convert this building into a restaurant, the number of on-site spaces you're going to have is going to be calculated, and there's going to be your seat count. And I think any shrewd business person would look at that seat count and say this is not a worthwhile endeavor. The use is too intense, and you couldn't accommodate it. You know, there is discussion about, you know, our parking requirements are more in line with suburban communities, but I don't know a much better metric at the moment that would be as successful in limiting intensities of use. The challenge it presents is that when a property does need to be redeveloped, and as Jeff said, there are some dogs in town that may need some redevelopment, that accommodating the parking requirements and maintaining the character of our streets can be challenging. Bob spoke in a number of his that a dislike of the look of some asphalt parking lots. And he even proposed, I don't think this got enacted or could have been enacted, but that give everyone with a surface parking lot 2 years, and then you've got to remove some asphalt and plant some more landscaping to come closer into compliance with open space things. So balancing that sense of place with parking requirements is still something we struggle with.
Yeah, and I think something very similar stood out to me in his letters too, that you could tell Bob was grappling with this idea that we needed to have parking requirements and that would help to temper some of the intense development pressures. I think that was incredibly successful, and we still see that being successful today. But then you also have to deal with, well, what does that look like? And in his letters, you could tell he was trying to figure out, well, I don't think he really loved the look of asphalt surface level parking. And so he's writing about, well, can we put more trees in it? Can we put a hedge around it? How do we deal with this so that we do control development intensity, and we look at, but we control the development intensity, but we also look at how to make a really charming, lovely place. And I think that gets into this concept of the green space, the open space, and the parking, and how it all works together. Because it was really important to him that the character and the charm be maintained everywhere. And he definitely didn't want to see the character and charm go away to just all seas of parking.
And I suspect some of the intent was just to arrest development, that the requirements were so onerous that it just kept the town a bit more frozen and made redevelopment at higher intensities nearly impossible.
Right.
So in addition to adopting the zoning code, Bob is credited with reinstating the Architectural Commission and passing that ordinance, and then also later played a pivotal role in the creation of the Landmarks Preservation Ordinance. What is the role of design review boards in relationship to the zoning code, and how do they work together to protect Palm Beach's quality of life and built environment?
I'm going to go first on this one. I think that the design review boards are really the glue that holds together the character and charm of this community. You have the zoning code, which is prescriptive. It gives you specifics for height and for setbacks and for lot coverage and open space, but it doesn't necessarily moderate character and charm and taste and beauty. And that's what I think the design review boards play. That's their role, is to make sure that that prescriptive zoning code is implemented in a way that reflects the character and the charm and the heritage of Palm Beach to make it such a wonderful place to be. And I want to point out, when the design review boards, whether it be the LPC or ARCOM review cases, they're not making arbitrary decisions on the cases that come before them. They're utilizing the criteria that's in their code to make an informed analytical decision based on what's being presented. And so there's different criteria in the Architectural Commission's code versus the Landmarks Commission code, but they use those criteria to make sure that what's being proposed to them is really implementing the intent of the code. And they're really making a reasoned, rational analysis of what's coming before them rather than just a subjective judgment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased because I spent 11 years on our design review boards, so I certainly think that they're essential. But anyone who's lived here has reaped the benefits of making sure your neighbor's home was insightful and contextual. So the reintroduction during Grace's tenure in 70 of the Architectural Review Commission and the passage of the Historic Ordinance in 79, in concert with the zoning changes, holistically were the factors that I think preserved the sense of space and built environment in this community. And these are not things developers or folks really love. I mean, we presently are under assault regularly with developer-initiated legislation out of the state that might preempt our local authority to make decisions for ourselves in our own community. We had it where a bill kind of caught all of us off guard that has limited our ability to protect single-family homes in the town of Palm Beach with landmarks protection. And every legislative cycle, there's bills where some lobbyist has snuck in text that might prevent a local, usually they're trying to build a big tower in Miami Beach, and we're collateral damage. But I'm certain there's probably influential developers here trying to push that. But absent design review, we'd be in a really tough place. That being said, when I think about areas we can do a better job at design review, I think inherently design review comes with the potential for some subjectivity. You're looking at, we all have preferences about what architecture we like or not, and sticking closer to criteria helps remove some subjectivity from the process, and it also make our decisions more legally defensible should they be challenged in court.
Absolutely. And I think I'll just add that Palm Beach is really lucky that we had the art jury that started so many years ago, nearly 100 years ago, and that set us on the path for this design review process that we still have today. Many other communities are not so lucky to have had design review boards 100 years ago that made sure that there was character and charm and a unique sense of place to Palm Beach. Palm Beach doesn't feel like anywhere else because the architects and the people who were working to design at that time made sure that it was architecture that was suited to the climate, that was suited to the location, that was new and unique and interesting. And so Palm Beach is incredibly fortunate. There's actually been, speaking of state preemptions, there has been legislation passed that many other communities can't enact new architectural review boards. Historic preservation boards, if it's a historic preservation program, can be acceptable. But communities, if they didn't already have an architectural commission in process or in place, generally cannot add new ones. So it's something that we're really fortunate to have that has continued for all these years in Palm Beach. I'm going to say probably developers that that perhaps didn't prefer to have architectural commissions directing what their buildings would look like and how to spend their money.
So we know that the code was adopted in the 1970s, and obviously it's evolved since that time. Has it stayed true to Bob's original intent, or do you think it strayed in ways that he may not have anticipated?
I think by and large it has stayed true. I mean, we are all. I mean, I didn't have the pleasure of knowing Mr. Grace, but my family was in town during this era of change, and I still have a lot of family in town, and we all reap the benefits of the passage of these elements and being really harsh on change in the 70s and early 80s. The bulk of the code really does serve the original intended purpose. As happens with regulations over the years, it's grown and gotten more convoluted in some ways that can be challenging for its usability. And a lot of times you experience a problem in the community and you correct the text in the code. But if you do that for several decades, which we've done, it feels a bit more like a whack-a-mole strategy than a holistic strategy. So there are elements of the code that have changed over time to correct, Amanda's neighbor built something unsightly and we're going to close the loophole. So there's a lot of those that make it challenging and somewhat contradictory in certain elements. Our hardworking staff in town hall works really hard with applicants to navigate through our code. So one of those intents of this process is a bit of a cleanup exercise too.
Yeah, and I agree. I think it's a little bit of both, that it does stay true to his original intent and has in some ways veered away from that. The parking number for one parking space per 250 square feet of retail, that is still in the code today. And actually there was talks about, back when the process was happening, whether or not it should be higher for higher parking requirements. So that's still in place. I think the dedication to green space and open space and landscape has followed through for all of these years. But then, like Ted was saying, there's a lot of code provisions that have been put in place to deal with one specific situation. And it's tough in zoning. It's hard to write a code that can deal with all situations at all times. But what you try to do is take a very holistic approach to what you want your community to be, put those regulations in place, and then perhaps that's where the variance process comes in when there is a true hardship, when there's a unique shaped lot or you have a historic building that needs to have something happen to it, and you rely on that process. And I think Bob wrote a lot about, wanting to be tough on variance and to make sure that there really was a true hardship and that somebody had tried to work with the code, but he recognized that there would be times when they couldn't think of everything. And so I think it's just trying to balance, trying to think of everything and recognizing that there are times that you maybe can't, and not taking the code so far in the other direction that you put in so many code provisions that it makes it bulky and difficult to use.
And Bob knew that in some of those writings I reviewed. I mean, he talks about that the zoning code, I'm going to botch the exact quote, but essentially that it was a framework within which to work, and that the joined with the design review process helped make sure things work.
Yeah, that's why he thought the design review process was so critical, because they could really make sure that the intent of the code was being implemented, even if there had to be some small variation somewhere.
I feel like you had an entertaining example of a change to the code. Are you willing to share that story?
So as I was preparing for this and in my many workings with the town staff and all the cases that we review, one of the examples that came up is that of all the many things that have changed over the years, there was a code provision that was written in that said that, gambling and bars and things like that wasn't allowed unless the bartender servers were either celebrities or Miami Dolphins cheerleaders. And so I think that's just one example of a highly specific.
I want to know the story about
I know, me too. I said I think it had to be in the 80s. I'm not, but I would love to know the story of why that was written in. But I think that's a great example of a very highly specific situation that probably didn't need to be codified, and was in the code until I would say just within the past few years.
Darn. Trends and planning principles change over time, and different aspects of urban design are prioritized over others. In light of the town's ongoing code reform efforts, what are some lessons that have been learned over the last 50 years that should be taken into consideration during the rewrite of the code?
Well, that one could be like an hour discussion, but I'll try to be brief. I mean, for me, I was really interested, for most of my life, the south end of town has just been a built-out environment, and the development pressures went on in this period in the 70s and 80s, and then it kind of got built out by the early 90s. Well, now, post Surfside collapse and this building recertification program, development is a real concern again in the south end, where I don't think it was for many decades. And indeed, planning principles have changed. I mean, there were some interesting documents in the between a developer named Weinstock, who'd done a bunch of development down there, and Bob Grace, where they're engaged. This is a developer and Bob engaged in a dialogue about what the rules restrictions should be. They talk about the Reef condominium that was limited to 3 stories. So they did 3 buildings on the site in lieu of another building where maybe if they'd been given 5, they could do 2 buildings, more space, more light. And they were having those arguments and discussions. And I think those are going to be really relevant as we look to those today, to have those, it's a trade-off. What's the preference, a lower height? Or did we want more green space? But some of those parcels down there are more kind of like Tower in the Park kind of zoning, which I think most cities have moved away from. But certain elements of that do make sense for that specific environment still today. And Aimee, you were talking about in town, to redevelop in our commercial district, our code might require you to be set back from the front and sides in a way that none of the buildings on Worth Avenue historically were built. So I think in some ways, to have contextual infill design, we should look at lessons learned over the past 50 years. The movements that look at traditional town planning and how to implement and receive back the things of those communities that we just love visiting and vacationing and walking. And they have a lot of those principles.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. If you walk along Worth Avenue, you have this continuous street frontage and this buildings meeting the sidewalk, and one retail shop pulls you on to the next one until you get to one building, which is the Chase Bank teller, and it's set back, and there's this break in the street wall, and it just feels so incongruous with the rest of Worth Avenue. And so I think it's looking at things like that, to see the lessons that we've learned, that even though it might be convenient, it does change the pedestrian experience. And so one thing that I think is happened over the last 50 years, and I anticipate, there's been massive changes in the past 50 years. I think there will be even more so in the next 50 years as we deal with so many different issues. But the 1970s was an interesting time period from a historic perspective, from a historic preservation perspective, because you had a lot of forces coming together. And I think a lot of the research I've done and a lot of preservation research that's being done on this time period was that a little bit the 70s didn't quite know what it wanted to be. And I say that because, you're coming off of the heels of urban renewal projects in the 1960s, and the car is incredibly important. Car is still king. So strip malls and shopping malls were really important, and they were trying to plan places for cars. But the historic downtowns, which were really the fabric of the community, were starting to suffer in those time periods. And so they're grappling with this idea of parking and cars, but also what do we do with our historic buildings? And it's also the era of a lot of environmental regulations. The EPA was started in 1970 along with the Clean Air Act. And so environmental goals were very important. So you see this kind of mashup of trying to figure out, well, how do we preserve the environment, and how do we look at green space and open space, but still accommodate cars, and what does that look like? And so I think we see a lot of planning from that time period trying to grapple with all of those things coming together. And then you add architecture into the mix, which was sort of the end of the modern movement, but not quite into postmodern movement, and again, didn't quite know what it wanted to be in the 70s. And so I think you have all of those things that are coming together in a time of intense development pressure here, trying to figure out, well, what do we really do with the town and how do we want it to look? And so looking at how it's changed over 50 years, I think we have a better understanding now of just how important some of these spaces in town are. And like Ted said, the example of making sure that Worth Avenue and our commercial areas continues to have that character and charm, and that it's walkable and friendly, and that the town in general is walkable and friendly and in a lovely pedestrian character, I think is really important.
And I should add that, I think an honest discussion about priorities as we look at writing rules that are going to serve us into the next several decades doesn't mean that a conversation about setbacks in a commercial district means that someone's promoting an idea of more intensity. There were discussions in Bob Grace's letters about imagining our one-story commercial structures all becoming 3, and he suggests that 2 is a more appropriate limit. Yeah. But I think that as you work with a building envelope and setbacks, that there can also be great protections for the town to prevent overdevelopment in the context of those decisions.
As we look to code reform and the town continues that conversation, how do you think the code could benefit both new construction and historic places more effectively?
And I think we've touched on some of that a little bit unintentionally before your questions. The historic structures certainly have always been a stronger candidate in receiving zoning relief in my book. They're stuck with a structure, they don't have a blank slate, and they can't comply to a new code, to current code requirements like a new build. I think there's a lot of lessons learned, at least for me in my prep for today and reading some of these materials. And I'm going to suggest that my colleagues and others kind of involved read them, because there's some great ideas and perspectives that are hyper relevant today and could be insightful. We've been at this zoning rewrite thing for a while, and I confess that I think some of us are feeling some fatigue and eager for some action. And we had speed bumps, as you do when you're navigating a process. But prepping for today kind of gave me a little more pep in my step to come back to that strong.
So I think that in terms of looking at new construction, making sure that the context is foremost in our minds. That's so much what Bob wrote about. Like, if your neighbor, look left and look right and do something that's in line with your neighbors. And you even see that in the Architectural Commission Code, which is we want to have similarity, but not too much similarity. And so it's trying to make sure that it fits in with the context. In terms of historic buildings, I think it's really important that we do prioritize making sure that our historic buildings stay part of this community, that they're preserved and protected, and that they continue to have a useful life that serves the community. I think there was a part of the video where Maisie was saying that some of the buildings in their travels were dead. They didn't have any life to them. And Bob thought that that was really a tragedy, and I do too. Historic buildings, they were typically built of good materials and good design, and they're meant to have a life that continues, and it changes from maybe one type of store to another, but they continue to go on and serve the community. So I think it's really important as we look at the zoning updates that we consider ways that we can incentivize these historic buildings to continue to be protected. We maybe look at ways that you have some sort of a waiver system that allows them to, do a small addition or take care of things that they need to. It shouldn't, to me, you shouldn't need 8 variances just to keep an existing historic building in its exact same footprint. But that's the result of where things have gone at the moment, is that sometimes if, a part of a wall is taken down, just to keep the building where it is, you need 8 variances to do that. And I think there's many examples in many communities where there's something that really better deals with nonconformities like historic buildings that we want to keep and treasure and preserve.
Well, and there was, on a closing thought, there was an interesting push and pull in some of the things I read, where the Biltmore Hotel that we all know as a luxury condo by Publix was at the time a vacant hotel. And Bob's wondering in his writings whether it's best that structure be demolished and come into compliance,
right,
no longer be non-conforming and the largest building in the neighborhood, and whether it'd be best to be under the current zoning rules and 5 stories to limit the intensity in comings and goings. And as anyone who's a decision maker has to do, you see he weighs it, and he started off one way, and then he pivots where he's become convinced that the conversion to the condominium was a much better use than the prospect of it saying, I believe his quote was, a third-rate hotel. So,
Yes.
so we come around to things,
Right.
and not everything can be so hard and rigid, that there are gray areas and compromises, but particularly with historic buildings and nonconformities.
Right. And that's why the decision-making process is so important. It gives the boards and town council time to consider and to take all of the facts and the testimony and really weigh the positives and the negatives of all the decisions.